Erev Tov, everybody. We are doing Rav Shai's second essay on Parashat Mishpatim, entitled Hearing the Cries of the Defenseless, or We Are All Responsible. While a lot of his teaching is influenced by his work on studying Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel, here he makes explicit reference to him towards the end, although in many ways this essay is built off a pretty remarkable Ibn Ezra, which I hope we'll look at inside when he quotes him. I didn't get a chance to pull it up in advance, but we will hopefully go right to it when we get there. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. Okay. Mishpatim number 2, hearing the cries of the defenseless, or we are all responsible. We are, of course, here just in the aftermath of the Aseret HaDvarim in Parashat Yitro last week, and now we have a lengthy section of laws of all kinds, civil, ritual, theological, no clear or obvious organizing principle. And then at the end of the parasha, we encounter a second description of the revelation and lots of discussion amongst the commentaries, what order all of these things over the last 2 weeks of parashiot took place. Here we're going to focus in on one particular one and extrapolate a little bit from there. Biblical laws, certainly to talk about laws and how we interpret them is very appropriate for this parasha, which has one of the handful of parashiot with the most mitzvot in it. I wonder if it's the one outside of Dvarim with the most mitzvot. I have to check that, but that's my hunch as I think about it. Biblical laws make specific, concrete demands upon us, but discerning the meaning of these laws for our own time can sometimes be extremely difficult. How does a law rooted in the ancient world continue to speak, inspire, challenge, and provoke, even in our own radically different one? Of course, we can sort of answer for ourselves that Rav Shai takes up this challenge often, whether it's laws or stories, in the kind of overall trajectory of the essays that we read, which engage and consider the laws in their own context very often, and then come around at the end to some type of application to the current day. So Parashat Mishpatim offers a fascinating case study. The Torah teaches, "You shall not oppress any widow or orphan." Let's see that pasuk, Exodus 22:21. Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. We're going to see a little bit of the surrounding context as well, but that's the pasuk of our focus. According to some scholars, an almana in the Torah is not equivalent to a widow in our modern context. By widow, we mean a woman whose husband has died. But in the ancient world, the primary issue is not whether a woman's husband has died, but whether there are any male relatives to be responsible for her after his passing. Ordinarily, Bible scholar Paula Hebert notes, the widow's maintenance would have been the responsibility of either her sons or her father-in-law. When these male persons were non-existent, then the widow became an almanah. The Torah worries that the almanah has no one to provide for her, and worse, that she has no one to protect her from those who would prey on the defenseless, especially since they fear no reprisals from outraged family members. Both the almanah and the orphan have lost their male advocate and protector, and so are exposed to endless social threat, right? We remind ourselves that in the pasuk, Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun, the same general interpretive principle applies here to yatom. Yatom doesn't mean an orphan from both parents, typically, in biblical or rabbinic literature. It means an orphan from the father, such that the normal structure of advocacy and protection and social economic safety net has been torn. So using that same interpretive principle brings us to suggest, or brings ancient Bible commentators thinking about the ancient Near Eastern world to suggest that almanah might also mean not just a woman whose husband died, but a woman whose husband died and the next up male protectors, providers are also not in the picture. And that's not the exclusive interpretation, but that's the one he's focusing us on here. The Torah's primary concern seems to be with the socioeconomic vulnerability of the widow and the orphan, but subtly picking up on the Torah's phrasing, you shall not oppress any widow or orphan, right? We saw it here, kol almana viatom lo tanun, certainly something which we, keep our ears open as we read through Mishpatim or other sections of biblical law. It does feel, sometimes the rabbis interpret something and say it's superfluous when it doesn't really feel superfluous. But here, we could very easily have expected the pasuk to say, almana viatom lo tanun. I think in somewhere nearby it says, mecha shefa lo techayeh. You should not allow a sorceress witch to live. It doesn't say kol mecha shefa lo techayeh. Right? There is something a little bit unusual about this added on kol. You shall not oppress any kol, widow, or orphan. Maimonides focuses our attention on their psychological vulnerability as well. A person must be extremely careful in interacting with orphans and widows because their spirits are very low and their feelings are depressed. This applies even if they are wealthy, even if they are the widow and the orphan of a king. Maimonides weaves together the Torah's demand for probity in the economic sphere and its concern with emotional sensitivity in the relational one. Nice description. How should one interact with them? One should speak to them only gently and treat them only with respect. One should cause pain neither to their body with overwork, nor to their heart with words, and one should show more consideration for their financial interests than for one's own. One who oppresses a widow or an orphan or causes them financial loss, let alone one who beats or curses them, violates the Torah's prohibition, Maimonides emphasizes. But so also does one who vexes or angers them or hurts their feelings. It sounds like, I don't know, I didn't look at this Rambam to see whether the Rambam himself explicitly makes the connection to the word kol, or whether that's Rav Shai's sort of gloss, that the fact that it says kol is really saying, in every way, you should not oppress a widow or orphan, not just socioeconomic, but emotional and relational. I'll try to check that back up and see if the Rambam makes that kol interpretation explicit, or whether that was Rav Shai's gloss. God warns of dire consequences if people mistreat the widow and the orphan. If you do oppress them, I will hear their outcry as soon as they cry out to me, and my anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your own wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. Just see those psukim, right? So right after saying kol almana viatom lo ta'anun, you should not translate it here as ill treat, oppress, afflict. Right, then we circle back im aneh te'aneoto, right? Implicit but. If you violate lo ta'anun, and you very much do oppress them, aneh te'aneoto, then I will heed their outcry. Ki im tza'ok yitzak, we have three doublings here. Aneh te'aneoto, ki im tza'ok yitzak elai, then as soon as they cry out to me, as they verily cry out to me, shamoa eshma tza'akato, I will very surely heed their outcry. And then v'chara api, my anger will blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your own wives will become widows, and your children orphans. So we have this tightly connected little section of psukim. We'll make our way back to the pasuk before it a little bit later.
What do you make of the doubling of the oppress?
Yeah, right. Because we might imagine normally that implies sort of an emphatic, right? Almost as which would lead us to typically interpret only if you oppress them very hard, which doesn't feel like it's what the Torah is getting at here.
Or like it's inevitable.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. That's interesting. If you oppress them, which is so likely to happen, almost it's sort of a reading of the sensitivity such that they're easily oppressed. Um, right. I was thinking about it as right, almost not necessarily how easy it is, but how immediately almost like the instant you oppress them, if you oppress them even a tiny bit, which is almost the opposite of the way we typically read the doubling, but it's sort of the tiniest threshold for oppressing. But it's a good question. We have to see what the other mafarshim say, because it's the other doublings in the pasuk feel more consistent with the way we normally see doublings. We go back there. Right. Sa'ok yitzak. There too, maybe it's a little bit unclear if they cry out to me strongly, or but then again, maybe it could be the instant they cry out, right? That's how it's translated here. As soon as they cry out to me, then I will very much hear. The Shema Eshma is kind of the easiest to interpret along the typical lines of doubling. These are maybe a little bit less obvious. So be absolutely worth digging into the Mefarshim there. Thank you for raising that. God warns of dire consequences if people mistreat the widow and the orphan. We read the quote. Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra notes that the text shifts between speaking to the Israelites in the singular and addressing them in the plural. Do not oppress, right? Lo ta'anun is in the plural, you all, ta'anun, as opposed to ta'aneh. But then if you do oppress, im aneh ta'aneh is in the singular. And I will put you to the sword, right? Varagti etchem becharev is again in the plural, etchem. And explains, this is Ibn Ezra explains, that the Torah expands the circle of responsibility to include not only those who oppress the widows and the orphans, but also those who see the oppression and remain silent. Therefore, it is written, if you singular do oppress them, I will kill you, plural. In a society where some are oppressed, all are implicated. There are no innocent bystanders. It's really a remarkable interpretation of the Ibn Ezra. I want to see if it quickly pops up on Safaria. Hold on a moment. Not there. How about here? If a person afflicts an orphan or a widow and no one comes to their aid, all are punished. The next verse therefore reads, my wrath shall wax hot and I will kill you. That is all of you. Yeah, that seems to be the comment that he's picking up on. So Rav Shai definitely elaborates and builds it up, but this is what the Ibn Ezra is pointing out. Okay. Just repeat that last bit. In a society where some are oppressed, all are implicated. There are no innocent bystanders, right? So again, coming back to the pasuk, even if one of you would oppress one of them, and then they cry out to me, I will hear any individual one's cry, and I will destroy all of you. Again, we can ask lots of questions about, how about the strength of the punishment, and Rav Shai will comment on that a little bit later on. But the shift from the wrongdoing being done by the individual and the punishment being rendered to the plural, one way to think about that is it must be therefore that everybody is implicated, and that's what the Ibn Ezra is suggesting as Rav Shai explicates it. Okay. In the ancient Near East, and indeed in much of Tanakh, it is the duty of the king to protect those who are vulnerable and exposed. In a variety of contexts, the protection of the weak was seen as the will of the God, and in Israel of God. And since the king represented the God's rule on earth, it was he who was tasked with being their earthly protector. Okay, so we have pausing for a broader ancient Near Eastern context to say that kings were charged with the responsibility of being the one who protected the vulnerable and the potentially oppressed. Ibn Ezra's insight thus points to a crucial but easy to miss dimension of the text. The law of the widow and the orphan in Parashat Mishpatim represents a radical democratization of moral responsibility. The whole society, and not just the king, is responsible to ensure that the widow and the orphan are not abused. For the Torah, God is the ultimate protector of the powerless, but all Israel must be their proximate protector. Okay, so this is the slightly homiletical, but I think a fair expansion that if we take the Ibn Ezra at its word, at his word, we take his interpretation, and we hold this as against the typical ancient Near Eastern context where the king is charged with responsibility for the needy and the vulnerable. Yes, God, like the king, is the one who's ultimately adjudicating and bringing the consequences for failure, but is actually appointing everyone to take on that responsibility as opposed to leaving it in the hands of the king. Almost to suggest, right, by contrast, in an ancient Near Eastern society, individuals wouldn't as much be held responsible for, obviously, if somebody directly oppresses a needy or vulnerable, but there's not a sense that everyone is responsible for protecting them and ensuring that they are secure. But in the Israelite community, that is the implication. Momentously, God declares of the widows and the orphans that God will hear Shamo Eshma, their outcry, as soon as they cry out to me. This language, now Rav Shai goes to a different textual connection, is reminiscent of God's having heard Vayishma, the cries of the Israelites as they moaned under Egyptian bondage. Okay, it would be fair to check, in the Chumash, how many cries has God heard up until this point, right? It is fairly unusual, I think, up until this point. I mean, obviously, we're only in the first 20 or so chapters of God's relationship with God's people. We can think about what cries does God hear in Breshit at an individual level, but at a national level, there is, very early on in Shemot, God hearing the cries of the Israelites, and it's notable to read that against this hearing that's taking place here. Yes, James points out, although it's interesting, does God say, I heard it? Or just I mean, obviously the point is the same, but at a textual level, I can't think of whether Shama appears there. The place that I went to in my head was Yishmael, with Vayishma et Kol Hana'ar Ba'asher Husham, which I'm going to check that now.
By the bush when he's starving.
Right, Vayishma Elohim et Kol Hana'ar. And the Malach says, Shama Elohim el Kol Hana'ar Ba'asher Husham. With Cain and Hevel. God just says, what have you done? Me'asita kol demei achicha tzoakim elai min ha'adama. Again, the narrative thrust is the same, but I don't see the shama there. Anyway, warrants more research to think about where else God actively hears cries of different kinds. But we have it here. So what's the connection? So this language, the cry of the vulnerable, oppressed Israelite, is reminiscent of God's having heard the cries of the Israelites as they moaned under Egyptian bondage. The same fate awaits these oppressors as that which fell on the Egyptians. This is from another one of Rav Shai's biblical commentators that he introduces us to, Ends. The point is profound and powerful. Just as God is moved to respond by the suffering inflicted on Israel, so also is God moved to respond by the suffering inflicted by Israel. Now, again, keep in mind here, the suffering is inflicted by Israel on Israel, but the overall point is the same, that we are not only the victims, we are also capable of being oppressors, and when we are oppressors, maybe regardless of who the victims are, but when we are oppressors, God hears the cries of those we are oppressing. As the cry of Israel against Egypt mobilized God, so now the cry of widows and orphans will mobilize God against, I would say, even against oppressive Israel. The prohibition on oppressing widows and orphans is presented in tandem with a similar prohibition on mistreating the stranger. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Right? That's our preceding pasuk in this little this little section, right? Prior to this, we have some various other cultic kinds of prohibitions. Now we've come to the interpersonal, and our 3 pasuk section that we've been focused on is preceded by v'ger lo toneh, same verb, v'lo tilchatzenu, ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You should not wrong a stranger or oppress him. This shoresh and tilchatzenu is very much language of the Egyptian oppression. So there's sort of a play there too, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Taken together, these laws point to the heart of the Torah's vision, something Rav Abi talks about often as well. God wants Israel to create an anti-Egypt, right? We're not just freeing ourselves from the society that enslaved us, but attempting to then free ourselves even from the mentality of that society. God wants Israel to create an anti-Egypt, a society in which the weak and defenseless are protected rather than exploited, loved rather than degraded. Accordingly, God's people must not show any sign that they are becoming like the Egyptians in how they treat others, whether fellow Israelites or aliens living amongst them, right? That's the point of this particular paragraph, I think, is to then expand the circle, because the previous paragraph talked about, yes, God will hear the cries of those the Israelites are oppressing, but the example was presumably a vulnerable Israelite. Now we're expanding it out to a stranger in our midst. God's self-identification as the patron of the powerless is central to the goals of the text. The dramatic, and for a legal code uncharacteristic, shift from a second-person prohibition, you shall not, to an impassioned first-person declaration, I will hear, and my anger shall blaze forth, is highly suggestive. First, it points to just how central compassionate treatment of the vulnerable is to God's hopes for how Israel is to live. Indeed, just a few verses later, God says that when someone behaves mercilessly toward the poor, God will respond, for I am compassionate, Chanun. Right? So there's some sense that this is so important that God talks to us about it and then says, like, I'm going to get involved. I'm personally, so to speak, going to insert myself. That's how central this issue is to me, says God. To behave compassionately is thus to walk in God's ways, to participate in some small way in God's own compassion, right? So there's that movement. If God is that way, then we should also be that way. Second, and more concretely, the warning may imply that human government was not well equipped to protect the rights of widows and orphans, and that God was thus their only recourse, right? So kind of the counterpart to this is what I value, and I would get involved if I have to, so you should behave like me, is also human beings are not so good at this, and maybe people will need God to step in these moments. This may also explain the ferocity of the threat. Your own wives shall become widows and your children orphans. While God would obviously prefer that the widow and the orphan escape abuse because the powerful are kind and compassionate, God's first concern is to ensure that mistreatment does not occur. So threats, even dire ones, also have their place. Okay, so this is sort of, up until we get to the direct application for today. We've looked at the psukim and gone through a series of components. First, defining what is the almanah. Maybe it's not every widow. Maybe it's the women who have lost their male advocacy structure. Expanding out to show how sensitive the Torah is here, based through the Rambam, based on the word kol, to include not just socioeconomic well-being, but relational, emotional, psychological sensitivity. The expanding out of the circle through the Ibn Ezra to recognize that, as Dr. Heschel put it, few are guilty, but all are responsible, right? In many ways, we're seeing this first in the Ibn Ezra, that the shift from if even one of you will do it, I will destroy a plural you, as a sense that everyone is implicated when anyone behaves this way, because we are all tasked with the typical ancient Near Eastern kingly royal role of being protectors, and then coming to sort of God's focus so much that in the same way God was concerned when the Israelites were being oppressed, God will step in against the Israelites when they are oppressing, whether a vulnerable fellow Israelite or a stranger, and that this is reflective of the overall goal that God has for us, having been freed from Egypt, to overturn the Egyptian vision of society and to all be invested in protecting the powerless, and that that's not so easy and therefore carries harsh consequences for violating it. Okay. What are we to make of these verses today? When in some parts of the world, at least, women are blessedly no longer as vulnerable and helpless when their spouses die. Now we get to the sort of what he said at the outset, that this can provide a case study about law when circumstances have changed. Sometimes biblical laws are meant to be illustrative rather than exhaustive. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel writes that the prophets tried to teach us how to think in the categories of God, his holiness, justice, and compassion. The appropriation of these categories, far from exempting us from the obligation to gain new insights in our own time, is a challenge to look for ways of translating biblical commandments into programs required by our own conditions. Okay, so we're at the goal of the Nevi'im, of course, one of Heschel's primary areas of focus, wrote his doctoral dissertation on the prophets, and that became the books, The Prophets, and not just an analysis of individual sections of prophetic literature, but an overall attempt to understand the work of the prophets, which was to, through their ferocious voice, and those who don't join us on Thursday mornings, please feel free, as we've been making our way through the prophetic literature, and we're in the thick of Jeremiah and really encountering these issues. Their absolute impatience and intolerance for injustice, trying to teach people how to think in these godly ways, includes trying to distill those attributes of God and apply them in ever-evolving ways to the realities of today. As I have explained elsewhere, Heschel does not spell out or offer examples of what he has in mind here, but I think he intends, and this is Rav Shai quoting himself in a place, I assume his book on Heschel, where he's analyzing this quote of Heschel's. But I think he intends something like this. Biblical laws are to be understood not merely as concrete norms, but also as paradigms. In other words, they invite each generation to develop contemporary commitments that apply the eternal essence of the laws to particular times. Thus, for example, a modern reader who learns of the biblical requirement to build a parapet around one's roof, Vasita ma'akel legagecha, Deuteronomy 22:8, will discern from the concrete norm that the Torah is concerned with a broader commitment to public safety. Similarly, one who reads of God's compassionate concern for the plight of widows and orphans should perceive in the Torah's words a broader mandate to champion the cause of the vulnerable and powerless, whoever they may be in a particular society. By the way, as a plug for a different dimension of our Bite programming with me, I think this intersects a lot the book we are discussing in tomorrow night's book club, Professor Chaim Seiman's book on halacha, the rabbinic idea of law, because it sort of gets to this question both about the written and oral law. How much are they fluid and how much are they fixed? And Heschel is saying here, at least at some level, even if there's not a formal halacha that one can say in an absolute fashion, emerges from the interpretation of these psukim, but there's, maybe we call it a prophetic halacha, which says that, yes, the Torah was talking about widows and orphans. We know that there might be other marginalized, vulnerable classes or groups in society, and the ethos of the Torah's description of how we should treat the widows and orphans should apply there. Again, can we say, that that's the Shulchan Aruch of this text? Maybe, maybe not. But at a level of the ethos of what the Torah is trying to get at, it can be applied to different categories and groups in different times. To refuse to read biblical norms as paradigms. In other words, to say, no, it only was talking about widows and orphans. And so even if today's vulnerable group is a different group, we don't have to not oppress them because they weren't included in the Torah's prohibition, right? To refuse to read biblical norms as paradigms is willy-nilly to destine significant swaths of the Torah to irrelevance. If there are no longer almanot in the biblical sense, after all, then the Torah's words may be beautiful, but they are also inconsequential. If we do not read such norms as paradigms, in other words, we run the very real risk of domesticating the Torah by admiring it, even as we rob it of its normative force. Biblical scholar Terence Fretheim, we've been meeting him a few times in the last few weeks as well, suggests that readers of the Torah are invited to extrapolate from the specifics of biblical law along the grain of the original formulations. Reading our verses, he insists, we are invited to extend our concern to include any injustice that might occasion the cries of the disadvantaged. When the Israelites can no longer bear their oppression in Egypt, we learn, God both hears their moaning and sees them. To be a religious person is in part to follow God's example, to listen even when others will not, and to see even when others look away. There it is. Thoughts, questions, reactions. By the way, just looking at the passage he referenced earlier about the coal, and in the Rambam that he quoted there, he just quotes the pasuk as it says, "Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun," and it doesn't make explicit that this is a reading of the word "kol." So I don't know whether, again, it seems like that might be Rav Shai's analysis of that extra that the Rambam is reading into that extra word. Questions, comments? Lance, go ahead.
It seems to me that you're talking about oppressor and oppressed, which is today thought of as left wing. And it seems to me that Rabbi Held is really part of those, you might call them Reconstructionist Jews, who really are social action people, social justice people, and not really Jews. Because what is anti-Semitism? It really gets down to the nitty-gritty here. It's a question of oppressor oppressed, seeing the world in those terms. But if you begin to see the world in terms of complexity, then it's pretty hard to determine who's who and what's what. The one of the points here that I was thinking about, not in this context, is the idea of a compassionate God and the idea of loving the stranger, which is, by the way, the theme of the article that was referenced here in the little footnote that Rabbi Held has, in which he talks about the stranger. And it seems to me that this puts us in a really difficult position, because if we have to love the stranger, love the neighbor, love the oppressed, then how are we going to live with Hamas? It becomes a really difficult problem. And from the problem of the world, they see Israel as the oppressor. Okay? I mean, it doesn't matter that there's H1 Hebron, where the Palestinians have a marvelous, productive society that actually sells Israel and totally undermines the whole concept of the victim Palestinian, completely undermines it. And I think this is a major problem that I have. I can't even sort out in my head a Mishpatim right here, because I'm just keep thinking about this woke business, or whatever you want to call it. And the ultimate of this, by the way, is Sean Maggott. Are you familiar with him?
I haven't read his new book.
Okay, and Sean Maggott is someone who believes in diasporism. Do you know what diasporism is?
General sense.
Okay. No more state of Israel. The diaspora is the place where Jews belong And the diaspora is a place where Jews can be a tiny minority and live in some kind of happy world without the state of Israel. And it seems to me that this is, undermines 8,000 years of Jewish history. Going back to in the Bible Lands Museum, they have evidence of I guess Jews who had numbers on their arms 8,000 years ago.
Wow.
Okay, so my personal belief is that the Holocaust, what I call extermination, didn't take place between the years of 38 and 45, but it took place long before then, and it's taking place right now.
I really appreciate those comments, and where I want to particularly sort of say a yes and is to that oppressor oppressed kind of paradigm and framework. I agree with you that too often in our world that is kind of held up as though it were black and white, and in fact, in many kinds of relationships, the power dynamics go in both directions, and the purported victim has more control or power than we might want to acknowledge or believe. I think that's absolutely true. And so the sort of black and white oppressor oppressed paradigm, I agree, is overplayed. In the case of the widow and orphan, though, it feels fairly reasonable to apply. To me, it seems like, and I think that Rav Shai, would say, I don't know, but it seems to me, or let's say Heschel, I think Heschel would say, yes, there are probably groups in society that we could look at and have a reasonable disagreement. Are they truly oppressed classes or not? Or is it slightly more subtle and complex? And if it is, then okay, maybe they're not the first priority where we need to exercise our biggest compassion capital, but that there do continue to exist truly, kind of, again, maybe it's never totally black and white, but primary oppressed groups or communities, and special attention is warranted there. But I really do accept your pushback that often, that if we just let everybody, if we take at face value everybody who waves the oppressed card, and don't sort of discern a little bit more the more complex dynamics, then we are being a little bit naive. So I'll certainly acknowledge it in that way. Thank you. Bracha, go ahead. We don't hear you yet. Go ahead and unmute.
This is not specific to the Parsha. I just wanted to remind you that even though I don't see my friend here, and I know she had other obligations as well, I had mentioned to you about dedicating the class in her dad's honor because it's his yortzeit tonight.
Yes, let me mention his name, Aaron David ben Yaakov Halevi Vigolda Rachel. And I think learning Torah can be retroactively applied, and I had it in mind as we began our learning. So I hope our learning contributes towards an aliyat neshama for him, this father of your friend. And I hope and imagine that he was someone in some way, shape, or form who lived out these values. If he's in your orbit, Bracha, I can only imagine that he is such a person. So thank you for mentioning. Did you want to add anything germane to the psukim or the essay as well? Always appreciate your thoughts.
Not at the moment. I don't think that this essay was written in relation to the current situation.
I agree. It certainly was written before it. Without wading into the political, and now I'm going to wade into the political. It's I think the shift in that very potent pasuk, I was about to call Rav Shai's writing a psukim, but in that very potent sentence where he says, just as God is moved to respond by the suffering inflicted on Israel, so also is God moved to respond by the suffering inflicted by Israel without, I think, to me, the point there is, when we look at a current moment and we see suffering that is being inflicted, we take Lance's point to heart that we don't paint everybody who's being who's in the way of what Sahal is doing with the same brush. There are very, very different kinds of categories of people. And we also, in the same breath, don't imagine that there are no consequences out there in the universe for the complicated endeavors that Am Yisrael and Medinat Yisrael is engaged in. It's complicated. It's complicated. And certainly at the realm of the theological response, how could we possibly even imagine? I agree that it's very, very tricky to try to utilize the framework of oppressor oppressed in wartime. I guess I would say it that way, in wartime. I think I'm sure Rav Shai would eagerly engage in a different conversation about the dynamics in peacetime. I think in wartime, it's much, much more complicated. Maybe not impossible, but much, much more complicated. Yeah, and then of course we can debate, is it ever peacetime in Israel? That's probably another level of exploration. Yeah. Other thoughts here? Yep, Dad, please.
You mentioned your Thursday class on Jeremiah. So a number of people in the class have commented, how can God punish the entire nation when not all of them were involved in oppressing the vulnerable? And I think here Ibn Ezra's comment and Shai's explication of it, I think is a good answer. Maybe they won't accept it, I don't know, but it certainly is a way of understanding it, that there are no innocent bystanders.
Right. You can be personally righteous and mitzvah observant, and even, pious in the interpersonal realm. But if you belong to a society where this kind of exploitation of the needy and vulnerable is taking place, you can't be considered blameless. I think that certainly is a Heschel notion, and one that Rav Shai is developing here. By the way, just one footnote that I think on the remembering that the framing question here was, how does a law rooted in the ancient world continue to speak, inspire, challenge, and provoke even in our radically different one, and offering this as a case study. So of course the thrust of this essay was not to see it merely as a case study, but to focus on the message of this particular mitzvah. Right? He didn't choose just any old mitzvah from the Parashah. But still, the framework of the essay was, how do we continue to interpret mitzvot not just as concrete and specific, but as paradigmatic? And so I wanted to share the footnote that Rav Shai has there when he's quoting that analysis of Heschel's comment. And he says here, I have suggested there, that's in his book on Heschel, where he's analyzing that quote of Heschel about, the job of the prophet is to distill God's characteristics and then, apply them to the current day or reality. So he writes, I've suggested there that this principle of reading paradigmatically should apply to theological commandments, and not just to ethical or interpersonal ones. Thus, one who understands that to observe the Sabbath is to offer testimony that God is creator, while human beings are mere creatures, may conclude that in a time of unprecedented technological power, additional forms of Sabbath-like acknowledgement of the divine-human divide are called for, and so on, right? So some sense that if the overarching message of Shabbat is to refrain from creativity one day a week and recognize that God is the ultimate creator, and while we are partners, we are also not the same, and we have to be mindful of how we exercise our creative powers, that applies not just to, not doing 39 prohibited labors one day a week, but also to extrapolating that message of care and caution in our deployment of technology, to other spheres as well. So I think that idea of reading, it's a nice kind of term to take with us, reading paradigmatically, reading the mitzvot paradigmatically, is Reb Shai takes very broadly and is worth kind of thinking about. Right. We sometimes do step one and not step two, which is to sort of say, what is the overall message behind this mitzvah? And what's the driving force or meaning behind it? And then sort of appreciate that. And Rashai is saying the next step then is to say, how might that play out in circumstances beyond the ones that this mitzvah is explicitly speaking to? And that's a sort of a charge and a challenge. And then, of course, again, we can get caught up in the debates about how binding is the force of any of those interpretations. Any other thoughts?
I think that's the hard part. I mean, most of us agree on the overarching values the Torah provides. It's the implementation of those values and, the priorities of those values create.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the interesting questions there is sort of communities perhaps form or coalesce around, right? Within an Orthodox community, I'd say actually there's a really fascinating piece of writing by Moshe Bain. I don't remember exactly what his role at the OU was. I think a lay president, not someone whose overall Orthodox approach I align with, but he wrote a really, really interesting essay about streams of orthodoxy and kind of the benefits of a real diversity within orthodoxy. It's really thoughtful, and of course I ask myself as I read it between the lines, does he count our shul as one of those streams or as something beyond? We've had some of those conversations, and in a certain sense, we could describe orthodoxy. Professor Alan Brill has done so much work on this, the kind of streams of orthodoxy. We could describe orthodoxy as a community of people who broadly agree on the actually binding, of course we could quibble about this too, but broadly agree on the actually binding mitzvot at a basic level. And where we disagree is how we apply how we read paradigmatically and take the broader Torah values and then play them out in different realms of our lives. Whereas we might say about other communities within Judaism that they might also read paradigmatically differently than we do, but they don't broadly agree with us on what's actually binding. So maybe one way to talk about sub-communities in Orthodoxy is sort of how do they array those paradigmatically read values. Yeah. Great. All right. Wishing everyone great paradigmatic readings of Parashat Mishpatim. And next week, I think we already mentioned in the email. And by the way, if you don't receive emails about the class, send me a message, text me, email me, so we make sure you're on the class list. Next week, God willing, I'll be in Israel. Looking forward to my nephew's wedding in just a little under 2 weeks. So next week I'll be in Israel. We won't meet, but I have an essay for Teruma, which will be sent to you. And then the following week, we'll learn on Tuesday night instead of Monday night after I get back. So looking forward to all of that.
Excuse me, what was the book? What did you reference about the different orthodoxy?
No book that I know that's been written, but Professor Alan Brill has done certainly a lot of talking about it. I don't know if he wrote a book or any essays, but he's got a lot of probably on his blog at least a lot of good stuff on varieties of orthodoxy. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Love to mom and dad. Good night to all.
Okay. Safe trip.
Thank you. Bye.